Welcome to session 5 of the Gospel of the Kingdom of God. This is the Allegiance to the King foundational class. If you're coming into this video series in the middle, you'll definitely want to go back to the beginning and be sure to watch the videos in order because they build on each other. Tonight's session is Sermon on the Mount Part 1. But before we get into that, let's do a quick recap of the previous session. So in session 1, we saw that the gospel is the kingdom, that is the rule and reign of God, which exists both now among God's people and in the future filling the whole earth. In session 2, we saw that Adam and Eve, and subsequently all of mankind, violated the commandment to not reject God's authority for their own authority. And this is what's meant by the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what brought about death. The good news is that God has made a way to overcome the problem of this permanent death by returning to his authority, to his reign and rule. In session 3, we saw that God's rule and reign comes through covenants. The new covenant is the final covenant God is offering to mankind to return to him. The man Jesus of Nazareth is the promised messianic king who initiated and oversees the new covenant. And then in session 4, first we saw that the Sermon on the Mount is a good place to find the terms of the new covenant. And we saw that it has 3 main sections. It has commandments, and you'll recall that we learned that the format of the Sermon on the Mount in terms of these 3 sections matches the book of the covenant in Exodus and Deuteronomy, the Mosaic covenant. And so the first part is commandments. The second part is called rulings in the Mosaic covenant. So we're going to call this section in the Sermon on the Mount rulings. And then the last part is blessings and curses. You know, you'll be blessed if you do what God says and cursed if you don't. That's the idea. And those 3 things exist both in the Mosaic covenant and in the Sermon on the Mount. In this session, in part 1, we're going to dig into that first part, the commandments. And then in part 2, there's in between the section of commandments, there is a transition section which introduces the ruling section. And then in part 3, we'll get into the first part of the ruling section, which is the remainder of Matthew chapter 5. And I'm calling this Doing the Commandments from the Heart. If you are interested in more detailed teaching on the Sermon on the Mount than we're going to get into in this class, you can visit our YouTube channel, Christian Virtual Fellowship, so youtube.com/Christian Virtual Fellowship, and go to the playlists section and look for the Sermon on the Mount playlist, and you'll see a number of videos there where we spent a number of months going through the Sermon on the Mount in detail. Okay, so let's get into part 1, Sermon on the Mount commandments. And this begins, I'm calling this is what's typically called the Beatitude section of the Sermon on the Mount, or Beatitudes. And I'm calling this the commandments of character, because these are, what we're going to see is that these are the character or characteristics of kingdom people who are under the reign and authority of God, people who are covenantal people, have these characteristics. So how they're commandments is that this is how we're commanded to be in terms of our character. And obviously how your character is manifests in all kinds of different ways outwardly. So the first verse is Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, and it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And I should say, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Again, we're not going to go into too much depth. But I will give you the sense of each of these. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So first of all, the blessed are the needy who cry out to God for help. So the poor in spirit, this idea comes from Psalms. There's quite a few Psalms that talk about the poor and sort of what they're like, right? This is the idea is the poor they're oppressed, they don't get justice, they don't have the means a lot of the time to have everything that they need in life and those kinds of things. And so for the poor there in Israel, what they would do is they would cry out to God. God had to be their caretaker, because otherwise they were, they would just starve to death, or suffer terrible injustice. And so they became characterized in Psalms by this idea that they're the ones who are crying out to God for help. So we see this in these first few Beatitudes are coming from Isaiah 61. And so this is how you're seeing these things there in Isaiah, is that they're characteristic of the people of God who are looking to him to come with this new covenant. And so these are the people who cry out to God. So kingdom people recognize their poverty, even if they're rich, and they look for God to care and provide for them. So this is a characteristic of kingdom people. Next verse, verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And remember, I said this is coming from Isaiah 61. And what we see there is that the blessed are the righteous who are mourning the continual destruction brought about by the wicked, by the wicked and by sin. And so the idea is that these people who are mourning, what they are mourning is they're looking around at all of the destruction that wicked people have brought and that the sin of the nation has brought. They're looking around at this destruction, that their temple is destroyed and all this terrible stuff. And they're mourning all of this. And so the idea is that kingdom people recognize the destructiveness of sin, and rather than glory or rejoice in that, they mourn, they lament to God for sin's removal and a rebuilding of righteousness in its place. And so this occurs first and foremost in our own lives, right? So we're mourning for the destruction of sin that we see in the world, but we're also to mourn the sin in our own lives, repenting to God and asking God to fix this problem, to help us, to help the world come out of sin. Verse 5 says, blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. And so gentle, this is a word that means humble, it means kind, that sort of thing. And so it's a pretty good translation. But you really want to think about this in a particular way. And I like illustrating it this way. So in my life, I have moved a lot of times, many, many dozens of times, and a lot of times in my 20s. And in all those times that I moved, a number of times were across country. Sometimes, we moved several times when I was a kid. I've moved across the country several times as an adult and with my family. And so I know what it's like to move. I have a lot of experience. And I've had experiences where I've had a lot of help moving. I've had movers that moved us. I've had a lot of friends that would come over. I've had churches that came with a bunch of people and helped me to move. And those are great experiences when you have a lot of help when you're moving. But I've also had experiences where I had little to no help. I have moved when it was just me. And it's not fun. It's really pretty terrible. And you feel it at a gut level when you're moving by yourself. Or you're thankful when one person shows up, but I don't know how thankful they are, because you're going to be moving for a long time if you got a lot of stuff and there's just two of you. And so, I know what it's like to not have help. And I feel that at a gut level when I see someone who's going to move, and what that does is it moves me to want to help them. So whereas there's kind of this running joke that if you have a truck, people are going to always ask you to help them move. And I do have a truck, and it's funny, I don't really have too many people that ask me that, but when I hear someone saying, and this could be just an acquaintance, I could barely know this person, that I will volunteer, and I will say, hey, I can come help you move. When are you moving? I will rearrange my schedule so that I help that person to move. Why? Because again, I know what that's like. I feel that at a gut level. And I've driven more than 6 hours to go help someone move. And so it's not because I'm saying that I'm such a great guy. It's because I know what it's like, right? I know how that works. So this word gentle, what you want to think in terms of this is, again, it's kind of the humble, it's the powerless. I got a bullet point on this. It's the people who they have suffered humiliation. They know what it's like to be humble and powerless. And because of that, then they treat people in this humble, gentle, kind way. And so that's the sense that we're to get here. So kingdom people, they're gentle and kind, recognizing not only that they are generally powerless against oppression, but because of their experience of humility, they cry out to God for help. So they sort of experience this in two ways. They've been humbled and they're crying out to God for help, and then they see someone else in need for help, and they have a humbleness towards them. They're, even if maybe they're in not as good a situation as they are, they're going to reach down and help them out, that sort of thing. All right, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. And the idea here is that these are people who are actively seeking to obey God's commandments. Because what does righteousness mean? Righteousness is doing the requirements of the covenant. It is covenant faithfulness to the terms of the covenant. So you're actually living up to your part of this agreement. That's what righteousness means. And so these are people who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're people who actively are seeking to obey God's commandments. They want to fulfill their part. They want to do the right stuff. They want to understand what God is expecting of them, and they want to fulfill that. And so kingdom people, I like to put it this way, crave. This is where the hunger and thirsting, come in. They're craving to do what God is expecting from them. And I want to remind us as we're going through this that the idea here is these are characteristics. They're commandments, essentially. This is what kingdom people have to be like to enter the kingdom. And so, we want to think about these as commandments. So, okay, I need to be a person who craves to do what God is expecting from me. In verse 7, it says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." Okay, so we need to do a little bit deeper dive into this to understand exactly what's going on here, because it would be easy enough just to see this word means mercy and merciful. And so, oh yeah, that makes sense. I got to be merciful to other people and not really get the full picture of where Jesus goes with this concept. And to get a little bit better of understanding, we need to first of all, we'll look at the definition of it. This is from the BDAG lexicon. It's a kindness or concern expressed for someone in need, mercy, compassion, pity, or clemency. So it does mean mercy in these senses, but you don't want to stop there, because it's not exactly being used in the way that you probably think about it. So let's look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. Jesus says this, "Now go and learn what this means." And now he's going to quote Hosea, "I desire compassion rather than sacrifice." for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So he's responding to some Pharisees here. But it's interesting, this quote from Hosea. That word compassion, that's in our word family. So the merciful and mercy, those are two different words in the same word family that mean this. Just like in our English, merciful is not the same word as mercy, but they're in the same word family. They have the same definition. They're just different parts of speech and that sort of thing. And that word compassion, that one is another of that family of words that means the same thing. And so I desire mercy. You could translate it this way: I desire mercy rather than sacrifice. But what's really interesting is Jesus is not exactly quoting that verse, word for word, because that word compassion there is a little bit different than the word that's in the Hebrew in the Old Testament. So if we go back to Hosea and we look at this, we're going to see something interesting. Hosea chapter 6, verses 4-7 says, "What shall I do with you, Ephraim?" And Ephraim just is a way. It was one of the children of Joseph, who Joseph, because he got the double portion inheritance, his two sons were considered equal inheritors with the rest of the sons of Jacob, of Israel. But Ephraim just gets used to refer to Israel a lot of the times as a whole. It's used a lot of the time for the northern kingdom. So it's referring to Israel. What shall I do with you, Judah? So that's the southern kingdom. So this is a way of just kind of referring to all of them. For your loyalty is like a morning cloud. And that word loyalty, we're going to see in a minute, that's our word. For your loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew which goes away early. Therefore, I have cut them in pieces by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and the judgments on you are like the light that shines. I desire loyalty rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they have violated the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously with me. And so we see this, for I desire loyalty rather than sacrifice. Well, why is it loyalty here? Why wouldn't it say mercy? Like when Jesus quotes it, why does he change it from loyalty to mercy? So the underlying word under loyalty, we've actually encountered this word in an earlier session. This is the Hebrew word chesed, and it means covenantal faithfulness or covenantal loyalty. So, okay, well, what's going on here? Why does Jesus sort of change the term to mercy? And so what we need to understand is what's going on in Hosea, the book of Hosea. Hosea, the bulk of the 14 chapters of Hosea is God over and over and over and over again saying that the people of Israel have been unfaithful, that they have not lived up to their covenant promises, that they've gone after other gods and all this kind of stuff. And so it's chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter, and God is just like, I'm going to bring about all these judgments on you, and I'm going to slay you and all this kind of stuff for your disloyalty and your idolatry and all these terrible things that you do, your selfishness, your greed, and yet in Hosea 11 verse 8, he says, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I surrender you, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I will not carry out my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath." So God has just spent many chapters, and he's going to continue some chapters after this too, of just slamming these guys for their unfaithfulness. and that he's going to bring about all the curses that he had promised in the Mosaic covenant and in Deuteronomy, and destroy them and all this kind of stuff. And then he declares, I can't do it. I can't do it. I got to have compassion. I got to have mercy on you, right? I'm not like a man. I'm not seeking vengeance on you. I want to bring you back into relationship with me, right? I want to have mercy on you. And so this is actually what Jesus is trying to get the Pharisees to see, is that this is what God's heart is really like. This is why he says, I desire loyalty rather than sacrifice, right? And the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings, is that God is looking for us to be like him. And so in this book of Hosea, we see that God is merciful, because even though he's rightly accusing them of all these terrible things and that they deserve the punishments associated with it, but in the end, no, his compassion is kindled. And so when we look back at this, this whole section here, we want to understand that when it says, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy, that kingdom people show loyalty to God by having compassion and mercy, even on those who've really wronged them, right? Even people who really don't deserve it. They deserve vengeance. They deserve justice in a big way. And that's, again, the book of Hosea. It's just endless. You just read through it and you're like, good Lord, all of this stuff. And then you get to that verse 8 and you're just like, oh, wow. Okay. And so God is telling us to be loyal to me is to be merciful like I am. All right. So that's blessed are the merciful. Let's keep going here. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. I want to go to Psalm 24 here. We're going to read verses 3-6, and we'll see a little bit of where this is going. Verse 3, who may ascend onto the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? One who has clean hands and a pure heart. So those are the one who has clean hands and pure heart. They're the ones who get to stand in the holy place and stand before the Lord. Who has not lifted up his soul to deceit and has not sworn deceitfully. So we see this tie in here. What's a pure heart? It's a heart that doesn't have deceit in it. It's a heart that is not trying to deceive God or themselves or anything else, right? There's just no deceit there. Verse 5, he will receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. This is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, even Jacob. And so we see a couple of things here about people with pure hearts. They don't have deceit in their heart, and they are seeking God. So in other words, they seek God, and to seek his face means you want to be in his presence, just like started off with. And there's no deceit there. They're not hiding anything. It's all out in the open. They're not trying to cover up anything. They're open before God, right? So this is, what it means to come before God with a pure heart, is to come with this complete openness, not trying to hide anything. And so what does this mean then? Going back to blessed are the pure in heart. Well, this is kingdom people. They have honest integrity in their hearts, and they put God above all else. But I want you to think about it this way. We all begin that process by coming to God, being honest about our sin. And so if we're going to have a pure heart, we have to go before God in repentance. I'm reminded of when David had sinned and committed adultery and murder, and he gets called out on it. And the first thing that he does is he falls before God in repentance. And in the psalm that he wrote about that, he talks about, God, asking God to give him a clean heart. And And so you can see this sort of process that if we have sin in our lives, in order to be pure in heart, we need to be honest about that with God and go to God in repentance, ask him to forgive us and help us to have a pure and clean heart. And then as we live out that life, then we can go before him in this pureness, honesty in our hearts, seeking his face. In verse 9, it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." And so what I want to point out here is that this is a person who actively promotes and works for peace. This is not a pacifist, right? So this, the difference between a pacifist and a peacemaker. A pacifist is not going to do violence to another person. They're not going to return violence to a person who is violent. They're taking it's almost like an internal stance. I'm not going to return violence for violence. That's a pacifist. A peacemaker, on the other hand, is a person who's actively trying to bring peace into whatever situation, right? So where there isn't peace, a peacemaker is promoting peace and trying to build and get peace in that section. And this is a big deal, right? So we see that, this phrase, they are going to be called sons of God. What does this mean? Well, God is a peacemaker, and therefore his children will be like him. This is how you are a son of God, is to be like God. The whole idea is a son was the representation of the Father, right? This is what it means to be the son of God, and it's what it means to be a child of God, is to represent him in being like him. We see that in 1 John when it talks about being born of God. It's a person who's born of God is a person who practices righteousness, right? They're trying to be like God, and so that's what makes them a son of God. So a big part of that is God has continually been trying to bring peace. God does not want conflict and violence and destruction and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't want that. He wants peace. So if we're peacemakers, then we're being like him. So kingdom people actively promote peace in every situation. Verse 10, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Okay, so these are people that are being persecuted, they're being insulted, they're being mistreated because they are doing what is right in God's eyes. Remember, that's what righteousness means, is covenantal faithfulness. You are being obedient to the terms of the covenant. And so this is a person who is actively seeking to be faithful, to live up to their part of the covenant, to do what's right before God in this covenantal relationship, and they're being persecuted for it. And he continues on with this idea in verses 11 and 12. "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." So now not just righteousness, but because of Jesus, following Jesus and trying to be like him. "Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And so just as the prophets under the old covenant, they were trying to get the people to come back to God, right? They were trying to get people to be faithful to the covenant, and the prophets get persecuted for it. They get persecuted and maligned and murdered. And so when we live in new covenantal faithfulness, so faithfulness under the new covenant, we're going to be persecuted. It's actually a promise in the New Testament. But we can take heart. We can take solace in the fact that that covenantal faithfulness, that's the thing that God is looking for. So if we're being faithful and we get persecuted for it, but we're just continuing in that same covenantal faithfulness, even though we got persecuted for it, it's a sign. Peter talks about this in First Peter. This is a sign for how we know we truly are a kingdom person, when we will suffer persecution for righteousness' sake. So kingdom people are willing to suffer for being a kingdom person. And more importantly, they remain a kingdom person. They remain with all of these characteristics, even through, serious persecution, even to the point of death. Okay. So then the next couple of commandments, I'm calling the commandments of consistency. So we had all these commandments of character. Now we have commandments of consistency. And the first is verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by people. So first of all, salt's good, because it adds good flavor, and you have to have salt to live. But if it doesn't do that stuff anymore, it's useless, right? It doesn't do any good. So if you think about that, and you think in terms that the commandments of character are salt, right? And so we're supposed to have those characteristics living in our lives. We're living up to those characteristics in our walk as kingdom people. Well, if we don't do that, if we lose those things, we're not walking in those kingdom characteristics, well, then we're like salt that's lost its taste. It's not good for anything. And then the second is like it. Verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. So you got this light, and, if the city's up on the hill, everybody sees the light from all around, right? And people don't take a lamp and put it under a basket where you can't see it, but they put it up on a lampstand. It's up where everybody can see. It gives light to the whole house. Verse 16, your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So again, the commandments of character, they're light. So if we're kingdom people, we're living out these characteristics of kingdom people. It has to be in a way where it's lived outwardly into other people's lives. It's kind of like when Jesus says, what does it do any good if you love your friends, right? Everybody does that. Even the sinners do that, right? And but kingdom people love their enemies. Okay, now wait a minute. That's like way outside of the comfort zone, right? So the commandments of character are to be a light and outwardly expressed. So kingdom people are characterized by all these commandments in a consistently outward way. So let's do a quick review. Kingdom people are characterized by relying on God, by recognizing the destructiveness of sin, by gentle kindness that is helpful to those in need, by craving to do what God is expecting from them, by showing loyalty through compassion and mercy, by honest integrity from the heart, prioritizing God above all else, by actively promoting peace in every situation, and by being willing to suffer persecution for being a kingdom person. So you can think of this as like our 10 commandments, right? This is what we need. This is how we need to live life in all of its different ways. And then kingdom people are consistent in these things, making sure that both inwardly and outwardly, they are always kingdom people. And so that wraps up part one. We'll continue with part two next.